mathematicians. Today we're going to be learning about fractions and decimals. To be more specific, we're going to be learning about converting fractions to decimals, and in this video we're only going to be focusing on terminating decimals. To get us started, we have 1 over 2. Now we know that 1 over 2 is 1 out of 2 equal parts, but to figure out how much we have in decimal form, we have to go ahead and divide the numerator divided by the denominator. So we're going to rewrite this as 1 divided by 2. That means that 1 becomes our dividend and 2 becomes our divisor. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 2 go into 1? Well, 2 doesn't go into 1, and that makes sense because 1 over 2 is not a whole, so it's going to be smaller than a whole. So what we're going to do is add a decimal point after the 1, and then add a 0. Make sure you bring the decimal point up to ensure that our final value is correct. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 2 go into 10? So ignore the decimal point for right now. So 2 goes into 10 5 times, and that's because 2 times 5 is equal to 10. So we write the 10 underneath and we subtract. 10 minus 10 is 0, so we don't have a remainder. That means that 1 over 2 is equal to 5/10. So here we have a different example. We have 3 over 4. And again, in order to write it as a decimal, we have to go ahead and divide. We divide 3 divided by 4. So that means that our numerator is our dividend and our denominator is our divisor. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 4 go into 3? Well, 4 does not go into 3, so we put a 0. And then, so we add a decimal point after the 3, and we add a 0 after it. And then we make sure that we bring up the decimal point so that we have the correct value. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 4 go into 30? So ignore the decimal point. Well, 4 goes into 30 7 times, and that's because 4 times 7 is 28. So we write the 28 on the bottom, and then we subtract. 30 minus 28 is equal to 2. Since we have a remainder, let's go ahead and add another 0, and then bring that down. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 4 go into 20? Well, 4 goes into 25 times, and that's because 4 times 5 is equal to 20. So underneath it, we write a 20 and we subtract. Now we have no denominator, so we know that 3 over 4 is equal to 75 hundredths. All right, so here we have 3 over 8. So in order to divide that, remember that we have 3 divided by 8. So 3 over 8 is 3 divided by 8, where 3 becomes our dividend and 8 is our divisor. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 8 go into 3? Well, it doesn't, because this is a fraction that's smaller than 1. So our value is going to be smaller than 1. So we add a decimal point after the 3 and add a 0. Make sure you bring up the decimal point to ensure that our value is correct. And then ask ourselves, how many times does 8 go into 30? Well, 8 goes into 30 3 times. And that's because 8 times 3 is equal to 24. So then we go ahead and subtract. 30 minus 24 is equal to 6. And so because we have a remainder, let's add another 0 and bring it down. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 8 go into 60? 8 goes into 60 7 times, and that's because 8 times 7 is equal to 56. So we're going to write the 56 on the bottom and subtract. 60 minus 56 is equal to 4. Now we still have a remainder, so let's try adding another 0 and see what happens. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 8 go into 40? Well, 8 goes into 40 5 times, and that's because 8 times 5 is equal to 40. So we're going to write the 40 and subtract. Now we have no remainder, so we know that 3 over 8 is equal to 375 thousandths. right? So here we have our final example. Here we have 6 over 10. We're going to rewrite that. So it's 6 divided by 10, where 6 is our dividend and 10 is our divisor. Okay, then we ask ourselves, how many times does 10 go into 6? Well, it doesn't, because 6 over 10 is smaller than a whole, so our value is going to be smaller than 1 whole. So add a decimal point after the 6 and add a 0. Make sure you bring the decimal point up, and then you ask yourselves, how many times does 10 go into 60? Well, 10 goes into 60 6 times, and that's because 10 times 6 is equal to 60. And then we go ahead and subtract. 60 minus 60 is 0, so we have no remainder. And that means that 6 over 10 is equivalent to 6/10. And that's it for converting fractions to decimals. And we're only focusing on terminating decimals in this video.